All right, everybody, welcome live back to my YouTube channel for another head coaching profile. And I'm going to start this one off just bluntly. This is a pipe dream. This is something Jet fans have speculated about since the media report came out just a couple of months ago. So we're investigating it. And I want to get a Steelers perspective on could Bill Cowher actually go from retirement back to the NFL? Is it possible? Can we dream the dream? Can we investigate? And to do that, I had a highly recommended guest for this episode of this investigation into Bill Cowher potential returning. His name is Alex Kozora. You can follow him on YouTube. He's got a thriving channel that we can only hope to achieve some of the success. Over 5,000 subscribers. You can just search it out on YouTube as well. And you can also follow him, Alex_Kozora as well. Alex, thanks for taking the time, man.
Thanks for talking with me, Paul. I appreciate it.
Well, so I get it. This is a dreamer's dream, and I will be honest. For Jets, for the New York Jets in particular, they've had a revolving door at the head coaching position for the last decade. And the interesting, media thing that has been out there is ever since John Gruden retired in the late 2000s, it was like 2007, 2008, after that playoff run that they had. He leaves the game, he gets fired, and they ends up going into the booth. And then every year, seemingly it was, hey, is there a head coach opening? Oh, maybe John Gruden. Maybe Bill Cowher could be that guy. And every year it went through. And eventually we just said, okay, guys, it's not going to happen. Let's move on. And then John Gruden happened. He came back to the Raiders. Of course, it cost a lot of money, cost a lot of green, and he's come back and he's had middling success in the NFL. So all of a sudden, Jet fans have been revved up again. Maybe Bill Cowher would make sense. So let me ask you, as a guy that's covered the Pittsburgh Steelers for a long time, Bill Cowher, could you even fathom him getting out of a comfy, cushy job at CBS to go back to the grind of being an NFL head coach?
Yeah, it's pretty tough to imagine that, to be honest, Paul. I think not that you're doing it. I get it's just investigation, but I hope no Jets fan is setting their sights too heavily on Bill Cowher because you're probably going to be disappointed. Because I'd be very surprised if he was ultimately the guy for the reasons you mentioned. I mean, he's been in it with CBS for a while now. That's a comfy, cushy job. I'm sure he gets paid pretty well. You don't have to have the wake up at 5 a.m. John Gruden type of style and grind the tape. And so it's probably not what Cowher wants to do right now. I know he's always left the door open to return. And I know one of the reasons why he retired was to spend more time with family. Kids are growing up now, things like that. And that would maybe open the door a little bit more now than, say, 10 years ago. But it's still hard to envision at this point. He's been out of the game so long from a coaching standpoint. He's still involved in football. Obviously, he has more flexibility at his current job now. And so it's hard to imagine. Not going to say it's impossible, but I wouldn't count on
So you're saying there's a chance.
it. Cracked or slightly ajar.
Well, let's go into it a little bit because I'll be honest. When it first initially came out and it was on the radio show, former Jets quarterback Boomer Esiason has a wonderful radio show and he's very close to Jets ownership. So it's interesting when his CBS buddy Bill Cowher and his relationship with the Jets, and when he released it, it seemed different than anyone else potentially releasing that story because it just went, maybe we shouldn't just completely brush this aside as just, oh man, it's Bill Cowher back in the cycle again. Maybe it means a little bit more. So when I started looking into it at first, like I said, I'm like, God, I don't want this old dude being a head coach. Come on, man, he's been out of the game for 15 years. And then I started looking at other head coaches in the past that have gone on long layoffs and come back. Now, obviously, there have been a lot of failures, but there's been some success stories. And the one I've been pointing to for Jet fans to circle to say there's a lot of weird parallels here is Dick Vermeil. He left the Eagles in the 80s. Ironically, 15 years later, he came back, and in his third year with the Rams, they end up greatest show on turf. They win the Super Bowl, and they win the championship. And the other parallel I saw is I'm like, so Dick Vermeil was 63 years old when he won that championship. Right now, Bill Cowher's 63. So maybe I've just been digging too much, and it's like that old Jim Carrey Netflix movie of 23, and all the numbers start adding up, and I'm like, this got to make sense. What's happening here? I'm drawing connections. Is there anything to that? Does that make it any sense, or is that just so far of a comparison from well over 20 years ago that you're like, you can't possibly make those kinds of connections?
But no, it makes sense. And it's not that Cowher wouldn't be capable of coming back to football. I think he would because he's still been around the game and obviously has a wealth of knowledge. It's not that he's too old to coach the game or the game's passed him by necessarily. It's just a question of does he really want to, dedicate the time that's going to be required to be head coach again. And that's probably where it's unlikely. So I get the parallels. I'm not saying that it couldn't be done, not saying that he wouldn't have success if he decided to want to come back. I just don't see those odds as terribly likely.
Let's go into the dream staff here. So we're just going to dream the dream. It seems unlikely. It seems like a pipe dream. But if it was going to happen, a concern that a lot of people have, but on the other side, they also say, man, he's got so many connections. You think he could build an all world staff because he obviously has his own coaching tree of guys that he could tap into. But some of the concerns potential is he'd bring too many old people on. I just did another of the series with Arthur Smith, the offensive coordinator for the Tennessee Titans, a more realistic candidate, for instance, and they questioned his ability to be able to get different guys in there because during that Arthur Smith run, the Tennessee Titans and Mike Munchak at the time grabbed a lot of old guys, guys that wouldn't leave, guys that would stay, and that created kind of a stale environment there in Tennessee. When you had guys like Dick LeBeau, who was at the end of his run as part of that staff, and others, so that was the potential fear there. Who are some guys that Bill Cowher could tap back into? And is that fear legitimate that if he did come back, he would just tap into his old roots of older guys that he worked with in the past, like whether Marvin Lewis in the 90s is someone he worked with or someone of that ilk?
Yeah, it's hard to say just because he's been away from the game so long. What would his approach be? I was going to mention Marvin Lewis as one name who worked as a linebackers coach with Pittsburgh in the early Cowher days in the early to mid 90s. And obviously, he's getting some buzz now as a head coaching candidate and had a lot of success, present day. So it's really hard to gauge. I don't think he would be so behind the times where he would just hire his buddies or people of his age and things like that. I think he understands the evolution of the game and the importance of hiring guys from the college system that understand, these players that can relate to these players a little bit more and know the new schemes and things like that, the spread system, the option offense, rushing quarterbacks, things like that. But it's really hard to know because it's been so long. He's been out of football, and so I don't know what his philosophy for that would be. Obviously, he's a more defensive minded guy. So I think the offensive coordinator hire would be more interesting. And that guy would probably have more freedom to run his offense than maybe the defensive coordinator would. Not that Cowher really called a lot of plays in Pittsburgh, but there still would be, he's a defensive minded coach. So it's a good question. I wish I had a better answer for you. It's just hard to really know what his philosophy on coaching staff would be.
A real interest in Bill Cowher for a lot of reasons is the fact that the Jets have had a lot of first year head coaches during the last 15 years. When they hired a coach, it was their first crack. You could go back to Herm Edwards, Eric Mangini, Todd Bowles, Rex Ryan. The only one that wasn't that is very recent is Adam Gase, and we all knew that that was going to be an epic failure. So that is the intrigue of a potential retread of going back in that direction. And the other intrigue is if you go back to the late 90s of the Jets, they brought in a guy. Now, obviously, he wasn't coming off any kind of layoff, and that's a big factor. But Bill Parcells, he had a commanding presence. He had something about him. As soon as he walked in, there was immediate leadership, immediate credibility. And it seems like that's immediately what Bill Cowher would have with the Super Bowl championship on his finger, his pedigree of success. And again, just he's a Hall of Famer. So do you still think he could command that kind of thing? And who is Bill Cowher? For Jet fans that, again, this was 15 years ago, for Jet fans who would just guess what the flavor would be, what the taste would be, who is Bill Cowher?
No, I think he summed it up well. I think there's certainly credibility with his resume, and I can give you an example of that in Pittsburgh when the Steelers had Mike Munchak as their offensive line coach. Not that resume is the say all end all; it's not. But the fact that he was a Super Bowl winner, Hall of Fame offensive lineman. I don't know actually if he won a Super Bowl. I think he'd been to one Super Bowl, but you get the point. A Hall of Fame player. That gave a lot of credibility in that locker room for some of those young guys. So I think he would be able to command it. I think obviously if you hired Bill Kerr, if he came back to coaching, the biggest things he's going to give you is that presence, that leadership, that winning mentality. He knows how to run an organization, not only commanding it, but letting his coaches coach too, kind of being knowing when to be hands on, knowing when to be hands off. Those are important things because I know so much with head coaching hires today is about, oh, the offense is bad. Find someone that knows the offense, fix the offense or defense or whatever. The head coaching role is so much more than that. It's a management role. It's managing people. It's managing staff. The creating the culture in that locker room. So if you're focusing a hire on just on fixing your offense or fixing your defense, you get an Adam Gase type of hire, and things typically go wrong. So I think you're going to get that element with Cowher, and then with Cowher's personality. I mean, I think that lore is pretty well known. The jaw, the chin, this fiery, passionate guy, honest. I mean, that was the similarity when they hired Mike Tomlin and Bill Cowher. Both guys are brutally honest, and I think that's the true definition of a player's coach. A lot of people say that Tomlin was a player's coach because he was a young guy. He was relatable, again, has funny quirks and sayings and things like that. That's not really what makes him a player's coach. And he kind of doesn't like the term in that regard. What makes a player's coach, an effective one at least, is someone who's honest, someone that lets you know where you stand. If you're playing bad, he's going to let you know you're playing bad. If they're going to, make a roster move, they're going to let you know they're not going to lie to you, and they're going to treat everybody with respect. That's something that Tomlin had, something that Cowher had. And so just overall, that commanding presence, leadership, has that resume, I think would bring a lot of value to any team.
If I would have grabbed everything you just said and just put it into a Google search, the other word would have been CEO. That's the
Yep.
word that Christopher Johnson, the acting owner of the New York Jets, when he did his press conference ahead of this head coaching search, he said he didn't like that term when a reporter brought it up, but that's exactly what we're looking for. Again, a guy that can have his hand in a lot of different pots. We talked about that again in our YouTube series with the Arthur Smith potential hire, is a guy who has experience in a lot of different areas. That's something where Adam Gase struggled, and quite frankly, we got to readdress this. Adam Gase was hired, as you said. That's the problem. Is like, oh no, this is broken. Square
Hmm.
peg, round hole. Got to fix this, and then ignoring the rest of the team.
Right.
And that's again where Adam Gase had a lot of struggles. So going into that facet, everything you just described about Bill Cowher is that CEO guy. What does a CEO guy even mean? And quite frankly, I think it speaks to the evolution of the head coaching position. That again, it's not just the head coach of a football team. You're really the head coach of a brand. You're the head coach of a
Hmm.
billion-dollar industry, and then more so with each individual team and their own representation. So it seems like that's an even bigger piece of it.
Especially in New York. That would be one difference for Cowers from Pittsburgh, which I don't want to call small market, but certainly didn't have the media presence and the criticism and the outsiders and the newspapers the way that New York does. So that would be one interesting adjustment hypothetically for Cowher, is as soon as he gets there, there's going to be a lot of pressure. I mean, Cowher had a couple bad seasons in Pittsburgh. Early 2000s, they were 6-10, 8-8. A lot of places he would have been fired, wouldn't have been able to rebuild that team, draft Ben, get back to a Super Bowl, and finally win one. So how would that work in New York would be an interesting element. But to your point about being a CEO, it's just about management, managing people, roster, knowing when to be hands on, hands off, knowing when to, let your voice be heard, but sometimes when to back off too and let someone else, take control of things. So that I think that's the touch that Cowher brings. I don't think he would have lost that in his 15 years away from being head coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers if he went to a new team. But it is just kind of that management role and handling the day to day as a head coach.
Let's peek into what you just said. So Bill Cowher survived some bad years, it sounds like, in Pittsburgh. And again, at that point, he hadn't won the Super Bowl. The Super Bowl obviously came at the end of his run.
Hmm.
Interestingly enough, this week we saw Doug Peterson fired. He won the first Super Bowl in the history of the Philadelphia Eagles. Pittsburgh, obviously a rich history prior to Bill Cowher getting there. Guys like Chuck Noll. I saw that crazy stat of stability. And first off, as a Jets fan, I have no idea what that means. But Chuck Noll, Bill Cowher, Mike Tomlin basically have been, not basically, those have been the three head coaches for like the last 70 years or whatever the amount of time is. And that kind of stability, again, the Jets have had like four different head coaches this decade, for God's sake. So like that kind of stability is interesting. But is that just an organizational thing? Is that why he's survived those down years? Because again, he didn't have the Super Bowl, and Doug Pearson had the Super Bowl, and look, it still didn't
Hmm.
matter. 3 years later, one bad year, in theory, he gets canned.
Absolutely. That was the shift in philosophy that allowed the Steelers to become, because everyone thinks the Steelers began in 1972 with the Immaculate Reception, and they were born in 1933, and they were terrible basically until the Immaculate Reception. And one reason, there were many reasons for that, but one reason was they just went through head coaches like water. They were just every single year they brought guys back, they would leave, they would come back. It was a mess, and so they finally found stable ground with Chuck Noll. And Chuck Noll's first year, he inherited a mess. He inherited a terrible team. They went 1-13. Noll won his first game in 1969, lost the next 13. And a lot of times you think same old Steelers, here we go again. But they stayed the course. They built through the draft. And again, yeah, Noll, Cowher, Tomlin since 1969, a pretty impressive resume. And all those guys were young. Noll was 34, Cowher was 34, Tomlin was 34 whenever they were hired. And so they found young guys, defensive minded coaches, and just good leaders overall. And so that's the philosophy of the Pittsburgh Steelers. That's why you were able to weather the bad times. Tomlin had a couple of 8-8 seasons back in the early 2010s, weathered those as well. I will say though, Cowher's time in Pittsburgh was not without some drama. There was a power struggle with the GM, Tom Donahoe, and Cowher won that, and Donahoe was fired. Kevin Colbert was brought in. So I don't want to pretend like it was all holding hands and singing songs in Pittsburgh because there were some tough times. There was a power struggle there, and ultimately Cowher won out. But overall, the philosophy, from the Rooney family has been stability, consistency. We're not going to have knee-jerk reactions, which is pretty rare in today's sports landscape.
Again, we're speaking with Alex Kozora. You can follow him on YouTube. Make sure you hit subscribe to search him out on YouTube. You could also follow him on Twitter at Alex_Kozora. Let's talk about what the next phase is and the continued phase, which is when Bill Cowher steps away, Mike Tomlin is the guy who's brought in. And once again, Mike Tomlin's name is brought back up as a guy that's proverbially on the hot seat and has been. But I want to talk about, first off, I just want to address the thing that I've heard forever, that Mike Tomlin won the Super Bowl with Bill Cowher's team. Is that true?
No, I mean, obviously, he won it early after taking over for Cowher, and you had Ben. It's helps when you're a head coach and you have a franchise quarterback there. But winning the Super Bowl is hard, and any one season, you got to go through your own pitfalls and things like that. So I think that is a gross oversimplification of the job Tomlin did.
And let's go back to Tomlin there for a second. So I watched, of course, the game, and I've seen you've already broken it down, and will continue to do on your YouTube page. So the Steelers, obviously, they start 11-0, and then they kind of fall apart, and then they still have the opportunity in the playoffs, and then they had that comeback against Indianapolis at the end of the regular season, and then you have the playoff game where I can't even imagine the reaction if there was a live camera on you for the 28-0 start for the Cleveland Browns. But it just was weird that Mike Tomlin had all these instances where he wasn't willing to go for it in certain circumstances when they were down certain points. It seems like from Steelers fans I've talked to, I was kind of preparing for this interview, and just the Bill Cowher thing in general, is that when they talked about Mike Tomlin, they said this isn't the first time they've had those kinds of criticisms about him.
Yeah, the thing with Tomlin, and he's still a really good coach. I'm not calling for his firing. I know some people are, but these last 10 years have been an undeniable disappointment. But with Tomlin, he is a go with your gut kind of guy. And Cowher probably the same way. Interesting thing with Cowher, not to sidebar too much, would be how would Cowher embrace analytics? I don't know if he'd be too keen about that. And Tomlin isn't either. They're one of the least analytical teams. Actually, they had an analytics guy who left for Duolingo, that language learning thing. So that probably tells you about how much this team's probably been rejecting that. And so Tomlin's a go with your gut guy, not with the numbers, and that creates a lot of inconsistent decisions. Sometimes he wants to be aggressive, sometimes he'll be more conservative, just based on his feel of the game. And so that can be frustrating because you don't know exactly what you're going to get from Tomlin game to game or even within the game, as was the case against the Browns. And yeah, that game was a massive disappointment. This was the Steelers' real shot to make a Super Bowl run, and obviously came up way short, and that's a big disappointment.
All right, let's go back to Bill Cowher just for a moment before we get you out of here, Alex. Let's assume that, again, he would take the job. If
Mhm.
you were talking to Jet fans, what would your concerns be about Bill Cowher at 63 years of age? Again, he would be 64 in theory by the start of a 2021 season, coming away from the game after 15 years, despite everything that he's done. 15 years is a hard thing to just overlook. Again, not every head coach that has had a long layoff has had success. I happen to pick the one in Dick Vermeil, but not everyone ended up a
Mhm.
success story. What would be your concerns if you're a Jets fan and Bill Cowher was hired about him being the head coach after that long layoff?
Yeah, I don't think I have anything magical or mystical in terms of concerns that I could offer. I think it is just the things you mentioned. It's been 15 years, and what does that look like for a coach? The game has evolved so much. And when Cowher won the Super Bowl in '05, they were a power running team with 340-pound offensive tackles. They ran the football like crazy, fullbacks, stuff like that, value on special teamers, stuff, things like that. And so, how well would he make the transition to a much different looking NFL today with Patrick Mahomes and company? That's impossible to say. I think he could make the adjustment, but who knows? And then just to the point I made earlier about analytics, and could you embrace some of the more modern elements of the NFL and the numbers and things like that. I'm not saying he couldn't do it, but would he be capable, or would he have an adjustment period to that? And then again, just being in that New York market where I mean, you're on the hot seat basically as soon as you get hired, and you better win right away. The Jets team is not in position to win. They're obviously in rebuild mode. I understand probably most people will recognize that at this point, but still, I think just the lights are a lot brighter in New York than they were in Pittsburgh, where you're not going to have the comfort and stability and time to build and draft, because that was the Steelers' philosophy: build through the draft, retain, and that's how they won. And that's going to take probably 3 to 4 to 5 years with New York. And will you be afforded that time? Maybe, hopefully, but owners, fans, they get impatient. The press gets impatient, and that could find Cowher on his way out as he's trying to build this thing.
And let me ask you this. So, again, the two coaches that were hand in hand, whether or not they would come back over the last decade plus, was John Gruden and Bill Cowher. John Gruden eventually comes out, but obviously it cost the Raiders a lot, a 10-year, $100 million deal. Now, I'm going to ask you to just kind of analyze them from afar. You're a Steelers guy, I'm a Jets guy, but analyzing the Raiders from afar, when you sign someone to that contract, it seems like expectations are even more so through the roof for a financial commitment of that
Mhm.
magnitude. It seems like if Bill Cowher would ever even entertain the idea, it would take something similar, some sort of large commitment, some sort of large financial investment. But first off, from afar, from the Raiders signing him, John Gruden, to that contract, do you think he's lived up to the contract?
No, I don't think he has. And I've been a big Gruden fan. I loved him in the booth, and I love Mike Mayock. And I think they have a decent structure there, but the results have not been there. And it's a tough division to win in for sure, with the Chiefs dominating that for probably the next decade. But I don't think anyone could say that Gruden has met the expectations and the weight of that 10-year, $100 million contract.
And what is that? That's kind of where I'm leaning to with some of these side questions as we get to
Mhm.
the main thing here. Is when you sign someone to that, is it one Super Bowl, two Super Bowl? Like what will quench the thirst of a fan that says a 10-year, $100 million deal? Let's put something similar on the table. Would probably take it, maybe even a little bit more for Bill Cowher to do something like that, and even at his age. But like, what satisfies that? What would then, as a fan or as an analyst, whichever hat you want to wear, that
Mhm.
contract, you're like, you know what? That worked out.
Yeah, I would say you better add some trophies, some Lombardis to that trophy case if you're going to get hired with that expectations. And it's hard to satisfy fans because you win a Super Bowl, you don't win it the next year, and everyone hates you. I mean, you see the criticism of Doug Peterson, of Sean McVay, guys like that. It's so hard to win in the NFL. Fans don't always understand that. But I think for Gruden, you just got to get back to the playoffs. I mean, just get into the playoffs, get into the hunt, give yourself a chance. Feel like you're building this thing, and they've taken steps in the right direction for sure. And some picks that were panned, no one liked the Clee Farrell pick when they took him third overall. He's playing pretty good football for them right now. So there's a process to it. But I think if you're gonna be John Gruden and the weight of that and the expectations, you better add at least one Lombardi to your trophy case.
Well, nonetheless, this has been a fascinating experiment. Just even discussing it, investigating it, talking about the possibilities for the first time with a member of the side that covered Bill Cowher for a long time in the Pittsburgh Steelers angle of it. Fascinating stuff, Alex. I want to thank you so much for joining us. First off, give another plug. Where can people find your work for all things Pittsburgh Steelers?
Yeah, you can find me a couple of different places on YouTube. Just search my name, Alex Kozora, on YouTube. You can find me at Steelers Depot. We're covering the Steelers all year round, and on Twitter at Alex_Kozora. And thank you so much, Paul, for having me on.
Of course. Thank you, man, and best of luck the rest of the way. It'll be fascinating to see what this offseason is for Pittsburgh.